Our speaker, that we all know and love, Stu Levitan, has been a mainstay of the Madison media and government since 1975. He has written extensively for local and national newspapers and magazines and produces Madison in the 60s, a podcast for WRT-FM. He's going to give an illustrated talk adapted from his new book, Madison in the 60s. Our thanks to UW Bookstore, which will be selling copies of Stu's book after our meeting out in the hallway, and the proceeds from the sales will benefit our Madison Rotary Foundation. We look forward to your presentation, Stu, and we have made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way of saying thanks for speaking to us today. As I welcome him to the podium, I want to remind you that time permits for questions. Please use one of the audience microphones as our program is being recorded. Welcome, Stu.
Thank you, President Jason. And yes, there will be time for questions. I know people might want to do a little payback, so we will give you that opportunity. I don't have to tell you how delighted I am to be up here talking with you today about my book, especially since some of you are in it. The book focuses on the 5 issues that dominated the decade: civil rights, the University of Wisconsin, urban renewal, the fight to build a civic auditorium, and student anti-war protests. The book also covers issues that are important every decade: politics, the public schools, planning and development, highways and transportation, law and order, arts and entertainment, and death. There are enough names and numbers in the book to make it a useful reference book, but it is not the encyclopedia of the 60s, nor is it an attempt to explain what the 60s meant to Madison or what Madison meant to the 60s. My function is more fundamental. It is to chronicle the reality of the political and civic 60s in Madison beyond myth and false memory, of which I have to tell you there are many. Once we establish what really happened, then we can talk about what it all meant and maybe write another book about it. But today we are going to focus not on Madison in the 60s, we're going to focus on Rotarians in the 60s. Because you cannot tell the story of Madison in the 60s without talking about members of this club. There isn't a single important issue in the entire decade that doesn't involve a Rotarian or two, often in a starring role. This should not come as a surprise. After all, Rotarians won 3 of the 5 mayoral elections during the decade and finished second in the other 2. The club counted among its members the next governor, the president of the university, police chief, all 3 superintendents of schools, a judge, and on and on and on. But I'm going to start outside of politics with someone who is still a future Rotarian when he appears in the book. A young neurosurgeon, Dr. Monona Causeway. It was Dr. Javid who operated, Dr. Javid who operated on the popular UW boxer Charlie Moore after he went into convulsions with a tear in a vein and blood clots in his brain after losing the NCAA championship at the Fieldhouse in April 1960. And of course, for more information about Charlie Moore, Doug Moe's book, Lord of the Rings, is where you should turn to. The operation was a success. Dr. Javid stopped the bleeding and drained the clot, but he knew there was little hope and said so. Charlie Moore, who probably would have been a Rotarian if he had survived, died a week later on Easter morning. Dr. Javid is one of 4 current members of this club in my book. And see if you can anticipate who the others are. I also have to give a shout out to 2 of the journalists in this club who were important to my research, Carl Gutknecht and Marv Levy. They are in the footnotes, they're not in the text itself. For my purposes, the most important Rotarian of the 60s was Henry E. Reynolds, the most successful mayor of the 60s, and someone I know I would not have voted for had I been here and of age. This is State Street a few months after his election in April 1961. Reynolds, president of the transfer and storage firm his grandmother started in 1888, served 2 two-year terms and accomplished 3 great things. He advocated for, and in December 1963, cast the tie-breaking vote to adopt the Equal Opportunities Ordinance with the state's first fair housing code over the strong opposition of the Madison Board of Realtors. Henry Reynolds called it the most important thing he did as mayor. He built the Monona Causeway. If you first came to Madison after Thanksgiving 1967, you have never known a world without the Monona Causeway. But some of you remember when Park Street was the only way in and out of the city to the south, and West Washington Avenue was frequently blocked by railroad trains. Henry Reynolds campaigned on building it, and he did, over the intense opposition of the Capital Times, because Mr. Evu believed the causeway would help those who wanted to kill Frank Lloyd Wright's Monona Terrace and build the auditorium and civic center at Olin Park instead, which it would have, but it was still absolutely necessary. Now, Reynolds was not able to build the auditorium anywhere, but he did stop Monona Terrace, the third great thing he did in his 4 years. Frank Lloyd Wright's last iteration of Monona Terrace Auditorium and Civic Center finished in February 1959, just 7 weeks before his death. Reynolds campaigned on killing it, and a year after his election, voters approved his referendum, formally abandoning the project and directing the city to look elsewhere for an auditorium and civic center. 2 other Rotarians also played a critical role in ending the project. The octogenarian economic development activist Joe Jackson, who said he, quote, thoroughly detested Wright as a man and despised him as an American citizen. No hard feelings there. And Wisconsin State Journal publisher Don Anderson. Were it not for these Rotarians and a few non-Rotarians, Madison probably would have built this Monona Terrace, preventing construction not only of the much bigger and much better Monona Terrace Convention and Community Center, but also making the Civic Center, Momoka, and Overture Center superfluous as well. So while the obstructionists killed Monona Terrace for what I regard as bad reasons, namely Wright's politics and business practices and lifestyle, what they did had a good result. I would also not have voted for the other Rotarian mayor, Bill Dyke, who, in my estimation, was not a success, but he did create the Landmarks Commission, so props to him for that. The second most important Rotarian of the 60s, someone I would have voted for, Patrick J. Lucey, seen here in 1966 when he was lieutenant governor and running for governor. A longtime friend and supporter of the Kennedys, former chair of the state Democratic Party, owner of the largest real estate firm in the city, Lucey was the only realtor to speak in support of the Fair Housing Code at the public hearing before the Common Council in 1963. Now, this campaign rally at the Stock Pavilion proves pivotal to the protest movement, as a small group of radicals heckle Kennedy into submission, forcing him to leave the stage without finishing his remarks for the pro-student, anti-war Pat Lucey. It is a profound embarrassment to the anti-war movement, and Lucey loses. He makes news again in 1969 for projects large and small. Following the Mifflin Block Party riots, he agrees to a request from Alderman Paul Soglin and gives a $1 a year lease on a lot in the 400 block of West Mifflin Street to the Mifflin Co-op for a People's Pocket Park. That same spring, he unveils Wexford Village, a planned unit development of more than 1 square mile on the far west side. December 26, 1959, the square as we enter the 60s. And as the 50s passed into the 60s, Madison's 2 police chiefs were Rotarians. One was straight-laced, the other disgraced. Bruce Weatherly was the young reformer police chief in his native San Antonio before coming to Madison in 1949 and joining Rotary. He was a divisive leader, so rigid and suspicious that he bugged police headquarters and even his own home. I got that from someone who later owned that home, Paul Soglin. Weatherly was fired in April 1959 for smashing his squad car after he had spent several hours drinking with his secretary at the Hoffman House on East Wilson Street. We have a very sad ending. The accident introduced Weatherly to painkillers, which he also abused, and in 1962, his wife Inez shot him to death in the bedroom of their home in San Antonio. She pled her case to the grand jury and was not charged. Police Captain Wilbur Bill Emery, 37, head of the patrol division, was named chief in November 1959, joined Rotary, and served throughout the decade. A former Marine of military bearing, he brought a somewhat militaristic attitude to community relations and was not forthcoming with information. His first summer on the job, the prim and proper Emery cites consorting with a divorcee as one of the reasons he asks the Police and Fire Commission to fire an officer, which it does. Oh, we'll go back one. Campus, late summer, 1967. October 18, 1967. Some of the 250 or so blocking the corridors in the Commerce Building to obstruct the napalm-making Dow Chemical Company from conducting job interviews. Yes, Rotarians were involved in the pivotal political protest of the decade, the Battle of Dow. And that is non-Rotarian Paul Soglin under the Red Arrow about to be beaten by Bill Emery's 30 police officers, the self-identified Dirty 30. You can see them with the clubs, which are coming down on skulls and foreheads. Before they themselves get attacked with bricks and bottles on the plaza, suffering fewer but far greater injuries than the students. And it was Bill Emery who okayed what was apparently the first use of tear gas to quell an on-campus anti-war protest. And whatever controversies arise over Dow and the protests to follow, Bill Emery enjoys the strong support of fellow Rotarian Stuart Becker, the influential president of the Police and Fire Commission. Attorney Becker, former chair of the County Republican Party, alderman during World War II, and director of the Madison Chamber of Commerce, pledges, quote, moral support to the police and fire departments when he's appointed in May 1967. And he criticizes the news media for publicizing demonstrations, quote, to a point that is very distressing to the citizenry. Stu Becker also dresses down the Equal Opportunities Commission director, Reverend James C. Wright, after Wright protests the way police handled a series of race-based fights and vandalism at a teen dance in Breeze Stevens Field, namely arresting 4 blacks and no whites. Your comments can only lead to heated racial tensions in the community, Becker White-splains, demanding Wright, quote, cease and desist from further ventilating your complaints through the news media. And it's a Rotarian, Judge W.L. Jackman, father of an Army captain serving in Vietnam, who presides at the first trial of Dow protesters in December. Rotarian James C. Bowl is the district attorney. Both are appointees of Republican Governor Warren Knowles. It is also Jim Bowl who, the following fall, shuts down the campus production of a psychedelicized Peter Pan and issues an arrest warrant for the decidedly non-Rotarian director because the performance included 6 naked co-eds dancing to acid rock under a light show. Community standards do not permit girls to dance nude before an audience, Bowl declares. And when Bowl wins convictions for the first 5 Dow protesters, Jackman makes his feelings known as he imposes the maximum sentence of 30 days. I'm only sorry I can't give you more, he says, ordering the 5 to start their sentences 6 days before Christmas. The state Supreme Court releases them pending appeal. In 1968, it is Jackman's the judge who hammers out a deal ending an historic and illegal sick-out by Madison firefighters Local 311, led by future Rotarian Edward D. Durkin, who would lead an even more illegal strike the next year. It is also Rotarian Durkin who brings a peaceful end to the Mifflin Block Party riots in May 1969, after Rotarian Emery's police again just wail on the students with billy clubs and massive amounts of tear gas by opening his Middleton home for a big pig roast. No joke there, just... but that does help explain why the police and the firemen did not always get along. And it is Rotarian Mayor Dyke who provides free city buses to take the kids to Middleton, Mifflin, and back. So I guess that's two good things that Bill Dyke did that I liked. There were, of course, many prominent speakers giving interesting and important presentations to our club in the 60s. Two in 1968 were particularly newsworthy. May 15th, 1968, it's epithets and eggs for Selective Service Chief Louis B. Hershey when the draft director arrives at the Hotel Lorraine for an Armed Forces Day talk to downtown Rotary. The Wisconsin Draft Resistance Union draws about 300 noisy protesters, their line stretching from West Washington Avenue to West Main Street. Most are orderly, chanting, "Hell no, we won't go," and other anti-war slogans, as about 50 Madison police and 20 helmeted Dane County deputies with mace and riot sticks stand by. One even has a very menacing axe handle. But a handful of the demonstrators throw about 20 eggs, coating Hershey's black station wagon and a few officers. The protest leaders reproach the egg tossers and seize the remaining stockpile, but the public relations damage has been done. Greeted with a standing ovation by the several hundred business and professional leaders in the Crystal Ballroom, the 74-year-old Hershey avoids a second confrontation afterwards by slipping down a back alley and out through a dry cleaning store on the far end of the block. A few weeks later, it's Rotarian versus future Rotarian, when school superintendent Douglas Ritchie tries to crack down on the young activist group High School Students for Social Justice and its underground newspaper High School Voice for alleged ties to the Students for a Democratic Society. Newspaper chairman and current Rotarian Jonathan Lipp denies the charges and denounces what he calls the authoritarian attitudes of school administrators. The Bascom Memorial Cemetery, March 1968. October 16th, 1968, downtown Rotary is the setting when Governor Warren Knowles declares that the university needs, quote, firm disciplinary measures so that taxpayers are assured it remains, quote, a center of academic discipline, not a never-never land of perpetual adolescence. We should tell the disruptors, the hippies, the narcotics and LSD users, the pornography peddlers that they are not welcome here. The several hundred business and civic leaders cheer his attack on, quote, students raised in a prevailing attitude of permissiveness, from pampering parents to overpromising political leaders. And this is 2 years before Spiro Agnew and nattering nabobs of negativism. That the cautious, moderate Knowles, a former president of the University Alumni Association, would make such a speech is seen as a bellwether of public opinion, and indeed, just 3 weeks later, Knowles easily defeats Attorney General Bronson La Follette for a third term. And you know how difficult it is to win third terms. The transformation of the Greenbush neighborhood, this is the Greenbush in June of 1960. This is something that most of you have never seen. The transformation of the Greenbush neighborhood into the Triangle Urban Renewal Area. As you may have heard, urban renewal was kind of a big deal in the 60s, and Rotarians were two of the most important leaders in the city's program. Rotarian Philip Falk, who had just retired after 29 years as superintendent of schools, was named chairman of the Madison Redevelopment Authority in April 1963, and 4 months later saw some former Greenbush residents hang his agency in effigy. Now, as chairman of the Landmarks Commission, I know we've done some unpopular things, but they ain't hanging us in effigy, at least not yet. Now, this crisis was not Philip Falk's fault. The mistakes had been made several years earlier, and his high public reputation probably helped save urban renewal as a referendum to abolish the redevelopment authority failed by, get this, 367 votes out of 36,665. It would take another Rotarian, Sal Levin, appointed director a few months after the referendum, to fully restore public confidence in the agency, leading to Sal Levin's appointment in 1968 as the first director of the new Department of Housing and Community Development. State Street, November 29th, 1963, my 10th birthday. And this is 2 weeks before the adoption of the Equal Opportunities Ordinance. Some Rotarians, notably Pat Lucy and Rabbi Manfred Swarzensky, were prominent supporters of the civil rights movement, but the club really can't claim any real civil rights leaders until future and current Rotarian Nelson Cummings becomes the first director of the new Madison Urban League in the summer of 1968. But he has so much trouble finding a 3-bedroom house to rent for Marlene and the kids that he files formal civil rights complaints and almost quits before finding a place on Odana Road, and we're glad he did. Rotarians were also involved in a story of religious discrimination. State Street, 1965. About the time Rotarian Collins Ferris, president of the Madison Bank and Trust, sets in motion a crisis over apparent anti-Semitism at the city's most elite social club, the Madison Club. Another Rotarian, Arlie Mux Jr., executive director of the Wisconsin Alumni Association and a member of the Madison Club board, sets in motion the crisis's resolution. It wasn't any secret that the club, where official city meetings were frequently held, had no Jewish members, or really why that was. So when Ferris invited Supreme Court Justice Myron Gordon and attorney Gordon Sinekin to apply for membership in October 1964, they were reluctant. But Ferris, a former Madison Club president, insisted that board members were, quote, determined to put this barrier to rest. Spoiler alert, they weren't. At least 2 of the club's 9 board members weren't, and that's all it took to reject their applications in September 1965, which greatly upset University President Fred Harvey Harrington, who had just joined the club at the urging of Mux, who did what he could have to get the applications approved. You tried nobly, Arlie, Harrington wrote Mux on October 5th. I do thank you for your efforts to open the Madison Club to Jewish members. Harrington was especially uneasy because he was statewide chairman for Brotherhood Week for the National Conference of Christians and Jews, so he quit the club and refused to meet with alumni groups there. The Capital Times breaks the story, the outrage is immediate, and the club finally changes its rules to make it more difficult for individual board members to block applicants. They changed the rules, and within a few weeks, Justice Gordon and Attorney Sinekin are members. Without Rotarians Arlie Mux and Collins Ferris, we don't know how long the Madison Club would have continued without having any Jewish members. It goes without saying that Rotarians made, turn that off. Thank you, sorry. It goes without saying that Rotarians made lots of business news as well. Here's Mayor Henry Reynolds inspecting the model of the skywalk that Rotarian Gerald Bartell and Robert Brooks said they needed to build across Wisconsin Avenue to serve the parking ramp and shopping mall they wanted to build where the Christ Presbyterian Church had just been torn down. This is, of course, the site of the current Concourse Hotel, whose general manager, the late Cal Worrell, would become a highly respected, say it with me, Rotarian. The same day that Bartell, an accomplished actor and inductee into the Wisconsin Broadcasters Hall of Fame, unveiled the pavilion, he and Brooks also proposed a 10-story Holiday Inn on the 400 block of State Street, on the lot that was still vacant 3 years after Victor Music burned down, now the Lisa Link Peace Park. I mean, no disrespect to his Rotarian son or Rotarian daughter-in-law, who I think came back from Arizona for this. But I think a 225-room hotel in the middle of State Street with garage access off West Gilman might have been problematic over the years. But then again, Lease Pink Park has been problematic, so it might have been a good idea. Some other items on the Rotarian business wire. January 6, 1961. Rotarian Walter A. Frautschi, president of the Democrat Printing Company, announces vice presidential appointments of sons John Jones Frautschi, Rotarian, and W. Jerome Frautschi, not a Rotarian. March 1st, 1961. Future and current Rotarian Frederick J. Mose, Jr. purchases the Kennedy Manor apartment building at 1 Langdon Street. 8 years later, Fred gets the rights to buy land in the Triangle Urban Renewal area to build 350 apartment units, but the project is not completed. Wait, we got to applaud for Fred. Fred's here too. We haven't applauded for Fred. Christmas 1966. It was a Rotarian succession at 910 Meyer Avenue in February 1966, when Oscar Meyer and Company names Rotarian P. Goff Beach Jr. the 4th president in its 53-year history and the first outside the Meyer family. He succeeds the founder's grandson, Rotarian Oscar G. Meyer Jr., who succeeds his late father as chairman of the board. There's a Rotary death in the company's family as well. Adolph C. Boltz, 74, retired senior vice president, dies on November 28, 1968, after suffering a heart attack. Boltz was the meatpacking plant's second employee when he arrived in Madison in 1919 to manage his father-in-law's new facility. Under his guidance, it became Madison's largest private employer with more than 4,000 employees at its peak. Boltz and his wife, Eugene Meyer, were also important supporters of several civic and cultural associations. There are several other Rotarian obituaries in the book. I don't have time to read them all. I want to end by noting the passing of these prominent Rotarians, all of them in the book and listed in chronological order. Insurance salesman, civic leader, and philanthropist Harry L. French. Broadcast executive, civic leader, and philanthropist William E. Walker. University president and biochemist Conrad A. Elvium. F. Edwin Schmitz, 75, a second-generation downtown clothier and civic leader, died April 14, 1968, following a stroke. Son of the founder of the Hub clothing store and chairman of Madison Bank and Trust, Uncle Ed was the longtime treasurer of the Wisconsin Student Aid Foundation. A semi-pro baseball pitcher in his youth, he was to receive the Pat O'Day Award at the Madison Sports Hall of Fame dinner in June, and I am wearing my suit from the Hub in his honor. Ivan Ivy Williamson began the decade as the University of Wisconsin's athletic director with 2 Big Ten football championships in 3 years, baseball's last great bonus baby, and a new hockey coach named Bob Johnson. He ended the decade with a winless football team torn apart by racial division and a $500,000 deficit. January 10th, 1969, the Regents dismissed Williamson from the post he assumed in 1955. He remained a professor of athletics in the School of Education. 5 weeks later, February 19th, Williamson dies of a head injury suffered falling down the basement stairs of his Maple Bluff home. Captain of the Michigan football team in 1932, his teams went 41-19-4 in 7 seasons and won their first Big Ten championship in 40 years. It was awful sad to read about the death of Ivy Williamson. He was the best football coach Wisconsin had in years. He won the games. He was one of the most brilliant students that ever graduated from Michigan. Roundy Coughlin, February 21st. And Joseph W. Bud Jackson, 90. Indefatigable advocate for Madison improvements and implacable foe of Frank Lloyd Wright and Monona Terrace, dies on May 23, 1969. Often called Colonel for his World War I service, organizing the Army's last mounted cavalry unit under General Pershing, Jackson was business manager for the medical clinic founded by his father, a Civil War surgeon. He left the Jackson Clinic in 1937 to found and lead until 1952 the Madison and Wisconsin Foundation, forerunner to the Madison Chamber of Commerce. a devoted follower of urban planner and landscape architect John Nolan, Jackson helped secure private funds for the University Arboretum, the Madison School Forest, 18 city parks, as well as public funds for such projects as the Municipal Airport, Veterans Administration Hospital, City County Building, Methodist Hospital, and the Beltline Highway. May all their memories be for a blessing. Thank you.
So, Stu, following with tradition, you have the first question.
How happy am I that I wrote this book? I'm really happy. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes for questions. Questions?
Nobody's got anything? I bring you as a guest, and okay.
Well, I can't believe nobody has a question. Okay. Fred Mose, no question?
Okay.
Anyway, tell us a little bit about your research and how you did it and how thorough it was.
Well, thanks to my friends at Jenny Jeffers and Greg Michaels at the Madison Public Library, I was able to acquire a digital scanner. Essentially, I read every day's newspaper for the whole decade. I read the State Journal, Cap Times, and the Daily Cardinal. Badger Herald comes in late 1969. After reading and digitizing every important story, so I have 34,000 digital clips. I tell you, the level of journalism at this time was so high, and the amount of detail and the amount of accurate detail, and it's the length of the stories. It was just a joy to read newspapers as they used to be. There was a lot of advertising. There was a big news hole. We had really good reporters, really good editors, and I pity the people who try and write the history of this age when all we've got are tweets and blog posts and uncurated stuff. And so my great thanks to all the reporters and editors and photographers of the decade that enabled me to write the book. And after doing all that research, then you go to the archives, then you read the oral histories and the private correspondence, and you go into the files. And my goodness, to live in Madison, Wisconsin and have the State Historical Society archives and the Memorial Library and the Madison Public Library, it is an embarrassment of riches. So I spent about a year in the library, in the archives, and Facebook was very helpful. There are a number of Facebook groups. If you grew up in Madison, you remember, and Friends of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and there were stories that I wanted to fact check with people who had been there. So I knew that there were a lot of people, for example, who had lived in the bush who were on one of these Facebook groups. So if I had a question or something, I knew that I could get people who had been here to answer it. So I had as much fun researching the book as I had writing it, and I had a lot of fun writing it. So just to go down and spend all day in the library and the archives and avoid contemporary issues and just live in the past. Living in the past. It's been a good time to live in the past.
We have one last question.
Yeah, thank you very much. In this age where we're all discussing Foxconn, people in Asia, not only from Japan, will say that probably the most successful FDI, foreign direct investment, made in America in the last 30 or 40 years happens to be in Walworth County. And that's the Kikkoman plant. And I wondered if you talk to people there over the years, and I've been acquainted with that for many years, they'll tell you that Patrick Lucy not only went to commissions, he went to many subcommittees in Walworth County to make that thing happen. Does he get credit for that in your good book?
He gets a lot of credit. He doesn't get credit for that because, well, I'll tell you, Dennis Dresang is writing the biography of Pat Lucy, so that's where he'll get credit for it. I had a very strict time frame. This book, 1/160 to 12/31/69, and it has a very specific locale, Madison. So things that didn't affect Madison or outside that time frame, that's why it's not the Encyclopedia of the 60s. So that would have been outside my scope. But Pat Lucy, as I say, the second most important Rotarian for what he did in Madison and what he was about to do in Wisconsin. I will be out there signing copies. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Stu. We are adjourned.